His extreme anti-government message is still a very popular one within the Republican Party, which for the last 30 years has embraced government bashing as a strategy to win elections. Remember 3 decades ago, Ronald Reagan's so-called scariest words in the English language? I'm from the government and I'm here to help. It's worked out well for Republicans ever since. And now Ron Paul is taking that message even further, calling for virtually the elimination of government, a libertarian paradise. But what his supporters may not realize, and what the supporters of the Republican Party may not know, is this war against the government plays right into the hands of the corporate elite whose efforts are trying to destroy the middle class and turn America into a neo-feudal economy, broken up into 2 classes, the super rich class like Mitt Romney, and the vast working poor class like the rest of us. Joining me now is a man who literally wrote the book on the anti-government strategy, Dennis Marker, former congressional staffer, journalist, and author of the brilliant new book, 15 Steps to Corporate Feudalism. Dennis, welcome.
It's great to be with you, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. When middle-class Americans cheer Republicans slamming the government during the convention this week, have they been duped?
They have completely been duped. And what I do in 15 Steps to Corporate Feudalism is actually describe step by step what were the 15 steps that the super rich used to convince the middle class to eliminate themselves.
And what, give me a sense of what some of those might have been. I really...
Well, I don't have many chronological order, but I can just say controlling the media, what I call Rush Limbaugh and Foxaganda, the Fox propaganda network, destroying unions, teaching people that taxes, even on the wealthy and corporations, are always bad, teaching people to hate their government, privatizing government, deregulation, global free trade, destroying public education, unnecessary wars, conning the evangelical church, the open lying, no accountability, corrupting the courts, especially the Supreme Court, and finally bankrupting or near bankrupting the country and state governments.
Wow, and everything in that list, it seems like, is either done or they're well in the process. Can the middle class exist without a government?
No, I don't believe that they can. And the challenge that I make to libertarians, and I've been on radio shows with Ron Paul's chief of staff and also a congressman from South Carolina's chief of staff, Republicans, and said, okay, show me the country anywhere that has a thriving middle class without a strong government. And in the end, that's where we don't get an answer. Right. There's always this idea of some utopian promise, but the reality is there's not a country anywhere in the world that has a strong middle class without a strong government that has the ability to regulate its giant corporations. And if you go back 30 years before this Reagan idea of deregulation, it wasn't his idea, but that's when they started pushing it, we had a government that was much more willing to regulate our corporations, and not surprisingly, we had a much stronger middle class.
Yeah, well, I mean, George Washington regulated corporations. His Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, his 11-point plan for manufacturers, you know, that was presented to Congress in 1791 and adopted in 1793. Literally from the George Washington administration until the Ronald Reagan administration, there had been hiccups along the way. The Civil War probably one of the more notable ones, but by and large, people had faith in government. They had turned to government during times of crisis. They had looked to government for solutions. What's the genesis of this bizarre notion that, as Reagan said in, I believe it was his inaugural address, that government is not the solution to your problem, it's the problem itself? Where did that come from?
Well, I think it came from the realization that the people at the top no longer needed a middle class. And then you have a problem. You have this giant middle class up in the 70s. And what I point to are 3 things that I think changed in terms of the need for the middle class in the United States. Improved global communication, improved global transportation, and automation. With those 3 things, all of a sudden, you could produce your products anywhere in the world, and of course leave the U.S. worker out of the equation. But then you have a problem. How do you get rid of the middle class? If you announced 30 years ago you're simply going to eliminate the middle class because they become redundant to the people at the top, people would have revolted. So then you have a question of how do you get the middle class on board with their own destruction? And that, starting with Reagan, is what you see. And so, you know, what I say in the book is the movement from JFK saying, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, to Ronald Reagan's, the 9 scariest words in the U.S. language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. I mean, that's an amazing transformation in a very short number of years.
What did Ayn Rand and her philosophy and that whole objectivist fad that you know was a very, very big deal in the 60s and 70s and 80s, did that play a role in this, or for that matter, Milton Friedman and the Chicago School guys, or any of the people who are given all this credit, you know, von Hayek and whatnot?
Well, I think surely, of course they did, and they still do, for that matter. I mean, the thing that's interesting is even as the policies have been implemented, and we're watching the destruction, the elimination of the middle class, the same people are making the same arguments. And so you could argue that 30 years ago, some of these people actually believed that they could implement these policies and still have a vibrant middle class. But I would argue that nobody could believe that today. Nobody that's actually serious and paying attention.
Yeah, but if all Americans, I mean, if the middle class by and large goes away and we go back to the kind of social and economic strata that you had in Victorian England, you know, that was written about by Charles Dickens in so many of his books so brilliantly, which seems to be the kind of normal, stable form of economy and government when there's not a lot of regulation. If we went to that and most of America had the income of Appalachia and the buying power, what happens to all those consumers? I thought the American middle class was the consumption engine that drove the production engine.
Right, and that's what I say, that's the way that it used to be. When they actually introduced this program 30 years ago, I worked for the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. And I remember telling colleagues at the time that they will say this being Reaganomics, the great promise of Reagan, but they would never actually implement it because it would destroy the middle class. Now, if I could figure it out 30 years ago, I'm sure that the rich people that hire all of their consultants knew exactly what they were doing. And so what I believe changed was now they can make their products anywhere in the world and sell them anywhere in the world. And they do. And so they can make the same product in a sweatshop in Saipan and sell it in India or sell it in China and still make their profits. And also, because of the way they've changed the regulations in this country, bring things in here duty-free and sell them at Walmart for minimum wage.
So the bottom line is that basically these transnational corporations don't give a rat's ass about the United States of America. And
well, that's obvious and definitely true.
Yeah. Dennis Marker, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me on, Tom.
My pleasure.